When I first drove down the quiet lakeside road that spring morning, the shimmering blue of Crescent Lake stretched out like a sheet of polished glass. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, the kind of scent that makes you think of fresh starts and hidden opportunities. I had just finalized the purchase of an aging two-story cabin tucked behind a screen of cedars, a property I intended to renovate and rent. It was a private lot, deeded long before the local Homeowners Association had sprung up, which meant I was not bound to their dues, their rules, or their nosy oversight. The driveway, a narrow lane of cracked gravel, wound through a curtain of overgrown shrubs before opening to the weathered structure. Paint peeled from the siding like curling parchment. The porch sagged a little on one side, and the dock was a skeletal stretch of timbers half swallowed by the water line. To me, it was perfect, a blank canvas with history and potential. My plan was simple: restore it to a cozy lakeside rental, maybe even move in part-time during the warmer months. But even before the first day ended, I felt the unmistakable prickle of being watched. Across the road, a row of identical houses sat in obedient lines, each trimmed hedge cut to military precision. From one of those pristine porches, a figure emerged. A tall woman with a stiff posture, blonde bob catching the afternoon light like a warning beacon. She marched toward the property as though the road belonged to her. Though I said nothing and kept to my quiet assessment of the porch beams, I could feel her eyes scanning every inch of me, of the house, of the gravel under my boots. Her presence radiated disapproval. She carried a clipboard, a small detail that would later feel almost prophetic. Without a single word exchanged, the message was clear. She was the kind of neighbor who measured the length of lawns and the tint of windows. The kind who believed an invisible badge of authority hovered above her head. The kind the internet loves to call Karen. That evening, after I'd unloaded a few tools and settled into the creaky old kitchen with a mug of coffee, a knock rattled the door. It was sharp and impatient, like a judge's gavel. When I opened it, the same woman stood there, framed by the fading sunset, clipboard in hand. Her eyes were icy blue, calculating. The conversation that followed, though I won't repeat every word, set the tone for everything that came next. She informed me, in a voice honed by years of commanding PTA meetings, that Crescent Lake's Homeowners Association required all property owners to register. She rattled off bylaws and mandatory fees, sprinkling in warnings about community standards and the good of the neighborhood. I explained, calmly and firmly, that the cabin sat outside the HOA's jurisdiction. The original deeds exempted it. The property was mine to maintain as I saw fit, as long as I followed county codes. Her jaw tightened with each sentence. Her parting glare was something between outrage and determination. A storm was brewing behind those eyes, and I knew she would not let it go. The following days confirmed my suspicion. Whenever I arrived to work on the house, tearing out rotted boards, measuring for new windows, she would appear. Sometimes she loitered by the road with her phone, pretending to take photos of the lake while angling the camera toward me. Other times she simply stood at the edge of my driveway, arms crossed, a sentinel of disapproval. Neighbors from the other identical houses would glance our way, their expressions a blend of curiosity and quiet amusement. A few offered sympathetic smiles when she wasn't looking, but no one dared interfere. I pressed on with renovations. New beams replaced the sagging porch, and fresh cedar shingles began to frame the roofline. Each improvement seemed to fuel her resolve. Then came the letter. A single sheet of heavy paper slipped under the cabin door one morning, written in precise block letters. It demanded immediate payment of HOA dues to remain in good standing and threatened fines for noncompliance. There was no signature, but the scent of her sharp perfume lingered on the paper. I ignored it. 3 days later, while I was sanding a window frame, the wail of sirens shattered the stillness of the lake. 2 county sheriff cars pulled into the driveway, lights flashing against the cedar trunks. My heart thudded, not with guilt, but with disbelief. The deputies stepped out, polite but cautious. They said they'd received a report of an unauthorized occupant and possible trespassing. From across the street, she stood with arms folded, her phone clutched like a weapon. lips curved in a triumphant smirk. After a quick check of my paperwork and a glance at the deed, the deputies apologized and left. Their expressions carried the same mix of irritation and pity I'd seen on other neighbors' faces. As their taillights disappeared, she remained across the road, unrepentant. The faint sound of her scoff carried across the evening air. That night, as I sat on the porch under a canopy of stars, a different kind of plan began to form. I had kept one detail entirely to myself. The house she lived in, the pristine structure with its ruler-straight hedges, was a property I owned. I had inherited it years earlier from an uncle and rented it out through a management company. She was technically my tenant. The irony was delicious. I sipped my coffee and watched the lake ripple in the moonlight. She believed she held the upper hand with her HOA bylaws and petty threats, but she didn't know the deeper truth. I wasn't just her new neighbor. I was her landlord, and that revelation would change everything. The next morning, the cabin smelled of fresh pine from the new boards. The lake shimmered under a sky brushed with pale gold. I tightened the last screw on a window frame, feeling a sense of calm resolve. The game had only begun, and the next move was mine. The lake shimmered like liquid glass the next morning, reflecting a sky so blue it felt almost exaggerated. From the cabin's newly repaired porch, I could see the line of identical homes across the road glowing in the early light. Every shrub in that neighborhood looked sculpted by a careful hand, every driveway swept free of a single pine needle. It would have been a picture of order if not for the tightening knot of tension that now pulsed beneath its calm surface. I had slept well, despite the sirens from the evening before, because I knew something she did not. That quiet fact, that her mortgage check ultimately found its way into my bank account, gave me a serenity that not even the previous night's theatrics could shake. Still, the air carried a new edge. The neighbors, once casually curious, now peered from behind curtains with cautious glances. The HOA president's decision to call the police had shifted the tone. It was no longer a friendly, if nosy, introduction. It was a standoff. I spent the early hours reviewing the rental files on my laptop. Her lease agreement sat neatly in a digital folder, signed and scanned. She had been in the house for just over a year, paying on time every month. There were the usual clauses about noise, upkeep, and, most importantly, respecting local laws. Nowhere did it say she could wield the HOA as a weapon against me. By mid-morning, I returned to my renovations. Sawdust settled in golden clouds as I sanded the old oak banisters. From the corner of my eye, I caught her silhouette once more. Rigid shoulders, arms folded, that ever-present clipboard like an extension of her will. She stood across the street, the faint sound of her phone camera clicking carrying across the still water. I refused to give her the reaction she wanted. Instead, I let the hum of the sander drown out the weight of her gaze. But I noted every detail. The restless tapping of her foot. The way she occasionally glanced at her own house as though someone inside might be watching her. Late that afternoon, I walked the short path down to the dock. The lake lapped quietly at the rotting boards. I imagined how it would look once restored. Sturdy planks, a small bench at the end, maybe a rowboat tied to the post. The thought was soothing until I heard the distant growl of a car engine. A white SUV slowed as it approached the cabin, windows tinted dark enough to obscure the driver. It idled for a moment, then crept forward and disappeared around the bend. A minute later, the sound of hurried footsteps approached from the road. I didn't have to turn to know who it was. Though she stopped a good 20 feet away, her presence was a storm cloud. I could almost hear the clipped cadence of her unspoken demands. She lingered there, eyes sharp, before finally retreating. Her silent visits were beginning to feel less like curiosity and more like surveillance. That evening, as I locked up my tools, a thin envelope rested on the porch steps. No return address, but the same precise block letters as before. Final notice. Failure to comply with Crescent Lake HOA regulations will result in escalating fines and potential legal action. Immediate registration required. It was laughable, of course, an empty threat dressed in official language, but it spoke volumes about her persistence. She was escalating, convinced that intimidation would wear me down. I set the letter aside and opened my laptop again. This time, I drafted a calm but firm email to the property management company handling her lease. I explained that I intended to conduct a routine inspection of the rental within the next week. The timing was not coincidental. The following days unfolded with deliberate normalcy. I painted the cabin's exterior in a rich cedar brown, the scent of fresh paint mingling with the sharp tang of the lake breeze. Each brushstroke was a silent act of defiance. The more I invested in this place, the clearer it became that no HOA decree could reach me. Meanwhile, the woman across the street, whose name I finally learned was Carol, courtesy of a neighbor's whispered introduction, grew more agitated. I noticed her pacing along her driveway at odd hours, phone glued to her ear. Sometimes she gestured sharply as if arguing with someone unseen. Other times she stared toward the cabin with an intensity that felt almost personal. Then came the first sign that she suspected something deeper was at play. One evening, just after sunset, I walked to the mailbox by the road. As I sifted through a stack of utility letters, Carol approached with uncharacteristic caution. Though she kept her voice low, her words carried across the still night air. She asked who owned the cabin, whether I had plans to rent it out, whether I was familiar with the standards expected around Crescent Lake. I gave her only vague answers, and the conversation ended as quickly as it began. But her eyes, sharp and probing, lingered a moment too long. The next morning, I received an email from the property management company confirming a scheduled inspection of her house. Routine, they said. Required under the terms of her lease. I could almost picture her reaction when she received the notice. The shock, the confusion, the flicker of fear that someone else had the authority to step inside her perfectly ordered home. By the end of the week, the balance of power had shifted. While I repaired floorboards and polished window panes, she scrambled to maintain control. Her visits to my driveway became less frequent, but her curtains twitched more often. At night, I sometimes spotted the faint glow of her phone screen as she stood at her window, watching. The lake remained serene, indifferent to the tension simmering along its shores. Loons called to each other in the dusk, their cries echoing across the water like a reminder that nature cares little for human disputes. As I set down my tools one quiet evening, I knew the next step was inevitable. The inspection was scheduled for the following afternoon. Soon, Carol would learn the truth she'd been circling without quite touching. The irony that she, the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood order, was about to be reminded of her own tenancy was almost too rich. I imagined her face when the inspector introduced me not as the man she sought to intimidate, but as her landlord. The thought settled over me like the first cool breeze before a storm. Morning sunlight slid across Crescent Lake in shimmering stripes, the surface a polished mirror that belied the tension gathering in the neighborhood. The day of the inspection arrived crisp and bright, as if the world itself anticipated a reckoning. I woke early, not from nerves, but from a quiet satisfaction that the balance of power was about to shift for good. The cabin smelled faintly of sawdust and paint. I spent the first hour tightening screws in the new porch railing, letting the rhythmic scrape of the screwdriver steady my thoughts. Across the road, Carol's blinds quivered with every movement. Even from a distance, I could sense her restless pacing. She must have received the management company's notice by now. Shortly before noon, a silver sedan rolled slowly down the lane and stopped in front of her immaculate driveway. The property manager, a soft-spoken man named Henry, stepped out with a clipboard and a polite wave. He greeted me first, as we had arranged, then walked toward her front porch with the brisk confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times. I remained on my porch, tools in hand, outwardly absorbed in sanding a window frame, but every detail reached me with sharp clarity. The way Carol's front door opened only a cautious crack, the slight hesitation before she emerged, the clipped tone of her voice as Henry introduced himself and explained the scheduled inspection. From where I stood, I couldn't hear every word, but I saw the moment realization struck. Her back stiffened, and she tilted her head toward me as if drawn by an invisible thread. Her eyes, wide with sudden comprehension, locked onto mine. Henry continued speaking, gesturing lightly to the clipboard. Carol's lips moved in a rush of questions, too fast, too pointed to be mere pleasantries. I recognized the spark of panic in her movements. She was beginning to piece it together. Eventually, Henry raised a hand in the calm, practiced way of someone soothing a difficult tenant. He turned slightly and beckoned me forward. I set down my sander, wiped my hands, and crossed the road at an unhurried pace. The crunch of gravel under my boots echoed like a slow drum beat. Carol's expression hardened as I approached. Behind the frost of indignation flickered something else, dawning recognition. Henry's introduction was simple, factual. He explained that I was the property owner and had requested the inspection as part of standard landlord procedure. He used the word landlord deliberately, and I saw the weight of it land. For a long moment, Carol said nothing. Her jaw worked, but no sound emerged. The clipboard she had once wielded like a badge of authority now hung limply at her side. The silence stretched until even the lake seemed to pause. Henry, ever professional, stepped inside with Carol following stiffly behind. I remained on the porch only long enough to watch the door close before returning to my cabin. I didn't need to see the inspection to know the storm brewing within. Carol prided herself on control, on dictating the order of her surroundings, and now she had discovered that the very ground beneath her meticulously trimmed hedges belonged to someone she had treated as an intruder. Back at the cabin, I resumed my work, but the air felt charged, electric. Through the window, I caught glimpses of movement across the road, shadows passing behind curtains, occasional muffled voices. At one point, Henry stepped outside to take a call, his tone measured but slightly amused. The inspection concluded an hour later. Henry emerged first, offering a cordial wave before driving off. Moments later, Carol appeared on the porch. She scanned the lake as though searching for an explanation in its placid surface. Then her gaze shifted to me. There was no more pretense of neighborly concern, no thin veneer of authority. Her face was a study in conflicting emotions, embarrassment, anger, something like fear. She lingered there, silent, before retreating inside and shutting the door with a sharp click. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in an uneasy calm. The usual sound of her meticulous yard work, the whir of hedge trimmers, the scrape of a rake, was conspicuously absent. Instead, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. I used the quiet to plan my next steps. Owning her home gave me options, but I had no intention of using them recklessly. I wasn't interested in eviction or public humiliation. What I wanted was something subtler, an end to the harassment, a recognition that the power dynamic she clung to was nothing but an illusion. That evening, as the sun bled gold across the water, I composed a polite but firm letter to Carol. In it, I outlined my expectations as her landlord: prompt rent, respect for neighbors, and, most importantly, cessation of any attempts to enforce HOA rules on properties beyond the association's jurisdiction. I kept the tone professional, free of malice. The point was not to gloat, but to set boundaries she could no longer ignore. I slipped the letter into her mailbox after dusk, the night air cool against my skin. From her window a dim light glowed, but no movement stirred. The following morning I awoke to an uncanny stillness. No rustle of curtains, no distant hum of lawn equipment. Even the usual early walkers along the lake trail seemed absent. I brewed coffee and stepped onto the porch, the rich aroma mixing with the scent of fresh paint. Then, around mid-morning, a soft thud reached my ears. Across the road, her front door opened and a white envelope slid neatly onto her porch railing. Carol emerged briefly, eyes darting toward me before she retreated again. Inside the envelope was a check for the next month's rent, delivered days ahead of schedule. There was no note, no explanation, only her precise handwriting on the envelope and the unmistakable signal of compliance. The small gesture carried a weight that rippled through the quiet neighborhood. She had acknowledged the truth, not with words, but with action. Still, I knew Carol's surrender would not be so simple. People who thrive on control rarely let go without a final attempt to reclaim it. The silence might have seemed like peace, but beneath it, I sensed the restless churn of unfinished conflict. As twilight deepened and the lake turned the color of molten silver, I locked up my tools and sat on the porch, the letter she had silently answered resting on the table beside me. The first battle was over, but the war of wills was far from settled. The following days carried a deceptive calm. Crescent Lake sparkled beneath a bright September sun, the water undisturbed except for the lazy glide of a lone canoe or the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. From a distance, it might have seemed that the tension had finally ebbed. But beneath the calm veneer, a new current of unease wound through the neighborhood, as subtle and persistent as an undertow. Carol's house, once a hive of regimented activity, grew oddly still. The usual morning ritual of hedge trimming and driveway sweeping ceased. Curtains that had twitched at every passerby now remained stubbornly closed. Only the faint glow of interior lights in the evening betrayed her presence. At first, I thought she had accepted reality, that her landlord and neighbor were one and the same, and that her reign of self-appointed authority had ended. Yet as I worked on the cabin, installing new window frames, staining the dock, and laying fresh gravel along the drive, I began to notice things that suggested otherwise. Small, almost imperceptible changes crept in. A pile of leaves mysteriously scattered across the driveway each morning, even when the night had been windless. Trash cans I had neatly placed by the roadside were nudged askew, their lids rattling at odd hours. One evening, a smear of muddy footprints trailed across the newly painted porch steps, though I hadn't left them myself. They were petty acts, barely worth a mention, but the pattern was unmistakable. Carol might have been forced into silence, yet she had not surrendered her instinct for control. She was testing boundaries in quieter ways. Neighbors began to notice, too. While collecting mail one afternoon, I exchanged a brief nod with a man from 2 houses down. His hesitant glance toward Carol's shuttered windows told me he had seen enough to suspect that all was not well. Despite the low hum of her provocations, I refused to rise to the bait. Each morning I swept the leaves, straightened the trash cans, and washed away any stray footprints without comment. My resolve seemed only to deepen her frustration. One evening, as the lake reflected the fading pink of sunset, a letter arrived in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a neatly typed page of complaints, addressed to the owner of the lakeside cabin. It accused me of creating unsightly construction mess, of lowering property values with non-conforming renovations, and of disturbing the peace with power tools. The language was coldly formal, the tone dripping with manufactured outrage. Though unsigned, the style of the prose was unmistakable. Carol had found a new weapon, anonymous harassment. I set the letter aside, neither surprised nor angered. Instead, I documented each incident with quiet precision. Dates, times, photographs of the scattered leaves and shifted trash cans. My goal was not revenge, but a record, a silent shield against whatever escalation might come next. Meanwhile, the cabin neared completion. The once sagging porch now stood sturdy and straight, its cedar planks glowing in the sun. Inside, fresh paint brightened the rooms, and new fixtures gleamed with a promise of modern comfort. The transformation was a tangible reminder of progress, of forward motion that no anonymous letter could slow, yet the stillness across the road remained unsettling. Carol's house seemed to brood in the twilight, its windows dark save for a single faint light in an upstairs room. Occasionally, I would catch the silhouette of her figure against the curtain, unmoving and watchful. Then, late one Friday night, the quiet broke. I woke to the distant wail of sirens, an all-too-familiar sound. Red and blue lights flickered through the trees as 2 sheriff's cars pulled once again into the lane. I stepped onto the porch in time to see the vehicles halt in front of my cabin. The deputies approached, their expressions apologetic but weary. They explained they had received a report of a possible break-in at the cabin. Someone had called claiming to hear glass shattering and suspicious activity inside. I invited them to inspect the property. Every window was intact, every door locked. The only sound was the gentle lap of the lake against the dock. It was clear the call had been a false report. Across the road, Carol's curtains twitched. A faint glow of her phone screen illuminated her face as she peered out, watching the deputies question me. When they left, offering another round of polite apologies, the night regained its uneasy silence. I remained on the porch for a long while, the cool air heavy with the scent of pine and tension. The false emergency had crossed a line. Anonymous letters and scattered leaves were one thing. Summoning law enforcement under false pretenses was something else entirely. The next morning, I contacted the sheriff's office to file a formal statement documenting the harassment, including the unsigned letter and the earlier visit from deputies. The officer on the phone listened carefully, his tone firm as he confirmed that filing a false police report carried serious consequences. Though I didn't name Carol directly, the implication was clear. Should the pattern continue, there would be a record, proof of repeated, unwarranted interference. Days passed without incident. The lake returned to its glassy calm. Even the faint silhouette in Carol's upstairs window grew scarce. I continued my work, finishing the last touches on the cabin, hanging curtains, sealing the dock, planting a small border of wildflowers along the edge of the porch, but I knew better than to believe the quiet meant surrender. People like Carol rarely abandon their campaigns so easily. She had shown her willingness to escalate, to call in outside forces when her own efforts failed. The question was not whether she would try again, but how. On a cool, windless evening, I stood at the end of the newly restored dock and watched the moonlight ripple across the water. The cabin behind me glowed warmly, a symbol of persistence against pettiness. Across the road, her house was dark, but I felt the weight of unseen eyes. The lake seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The first days of October arrived with a restless wind that swept dry leaves across the lane and painted the lake in shifting shades of pewter. The air smelled of wood smoke from distant chimneys, a reminder that autumn had begun to tighten its grip. The cabin stood ready for the season, porch sealed, windows caulked, and a faint scent of cedar oil lingering where I had finished the last coats of stain. On the surface, life along Crescent Lake appeared peaceful again. Carol's blinds opened some mornings to reveal slivers of careful domesticity, the glint of polished counters, the brief appearance of a coffee mug in her hand. The neighborhood joggers returned to their dawn routines, their rhythmic footsteps echoing across the road. Even the loons seemed to call more cheerfully across the water. Yet beneath the veneer of normalcy, a quiet vigilance remained. I had filed my statement with the sheriff's office and documented every small provocation. I worked each day with deliberate calm, but always with a sense that the silence might break without warning. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the next ripple appeared. While sanding the final edge of a porch step, I noticed a cluster of cars parked near the HOA's small community center down the road. The site wasn't unusual. Residents often met there for planning sessions. But something about the tightly gathered group of vehicles, all arriving within minutes of each other, suggested more than a casual coffee gathering. Later that evening, a neighbor named Martin, whom I had spoken with only briefly in passing, approached my driveway. His tone was cautious, but his eyes carried the spark of someone who wanted to share a secret. He told me, almost in a whisper, that the HOA had convened a special meeting to discuss non-compliant properties along the lakefront. Though he didn't mention Carol by name, the implication was obvious. The meeting had her fingerprints all over it. I thanked Martin for the warning and returned to the cabin with a quiet resolve. The HOA might have rules for its members, but the cabin's deed remained crystal clear, exempt from their jurisdiction. Still, I gathered every document, property records, county zoning letters, the original exemption papers, and stored them neatly in a folder on my desk. 2 days later, a thick envelope appeared in my mailbox. The letterhead bore the HOA's emblem, a stylized image of the lake framed by symmetrical trees. Inside was a formal notice, declaring that the owner of the property at Lakeside Parcel 14B is required to attend a compliance hearing regarding repeated disturbances and visual inconsistencies with neighborhood standards. The wording was heavy with legal jargon, as though designed to intimidate. At the bottom, in an elegant but unmistakably sharp signature, was Carol's name, chairperson of the Crescent Lake HOA. I read the letter twice, then carefully placed it back in the envelope. The next day, I drove to the county office with my folder of documents. The clerk at the records desk smiled knowingly when I explained the situation. Within minutes, she produced a certified copy of the original deed and a statement confirming that the property lay outside the HOA's governance. Her casual efficiency made the HOA's letter feel almost absurd. I returned home just as the late afternoon sun dipped low, bathing the lake in amber light. Across the road, Carol's front door opened. She stepped out wearing a tailored jacket, clipboard clutched like a shield. Even at a distance, I could sense her anticipation, as though she expected me to march over and plead for leniency. Instead, I simply waved and carried my folder inside. The scheduled hearing took place the following Saturday. I didn't attend. Instead, I spent the morning on the dock, sipping coffee and watching a pair of herons glide across the water. Occasionally, the faint sound of voices drifted from the community center, a murmur of bureaucratic energy that meant nothing to me. By early afternoon, the meeting broke up. Cars trickled out one by one, their occupants wearing expressions ranging from bemusement to quiet irritation. Martin passed by again later and, with a half-smile, reported that the HOA's attempt to claim jurisdiction over my property had unraveled quickly. County records, he said, left no room for debate. Carol, however, was not finished. That evening she appeared at the edge of her driveway, clipboard in hand, her posture a portrait of barely restrained fury. She lingered there as the sky turned indigo, staring toward the cabin with a tight-lipped intensity. The next morning, a new letter arrived. This one bore no HOA logo, just a single sheet of paper with terse, handwritten lines. You are destroying the character of this community. Your defiance will not go unnoticed. Some of us care about order. The handwriting, unmistakable despite its attempt at anonymity, belonged to Carol. I read it once, then placed it carefully atop the growing stack of documentation. I felt no anger, only a steady clarity. The path forward was simple: remain calm, remain lawful, and allow her own obsession to undo itself. As the week progressed, I noticed subtle shifts around her property. The immaculate lawn showed the first hints of neglect, edges not quite trimmed, a hedge slightly uneven. Neighbors who once waved politely at her now passed with guarded nods, their eyes flicking toward me with a quiet sympathy. The isolation she had cultivated for me seemed to be folding back onto her. On a chilly Thursday evening, while I stood on the porch watching mist curl over the water, Carol's house went dark. No upstairs light, no silhouette behind the curtains. For the first time since I had arrived, her presence felt distant, almost diminished. The wind carried the scent of rain, and the lake shivered under the first drops of a coming storm. The cabin glowed warmly behind me, solid and secure. I sensed that the tide was turning, not through confrontation, but through the slow erosion of her own relentless need for control. Yet even as the night settled in, I remained alert. People like Carol seldom disappear quietly. There is always one final move waiting in the shadows, a last attempt to reclaim the authority they believe is theirs by right. The lake, calm and endless, seemed to wait with me. October's last weekend arrived with a brittle wind that rattled the branches and scattered copper leaves across the lane. The lake mirrored a pewter sky, rippled only by the occasional flight of geese heading south. The cabin stood finished now, cedar siding gleaming, porch lights casting a steady glow against the early dusk. What had begun as a weathered relic was now a warm, inviting retreat. Its quiet strength a contrast to the unease that still lingered across the road. For nearly a week, Carol's house had remained unsettlingly silent. No early morning yard work, no furtive glances from behind curtains, no flicker of an upstairs light after dark. The neighborhood itself seemed to exhale, as if holding a collective breath of relief. But I had learned enough about Carol to know that silence did not mean surrender. It meant calculation. On the last Sunday of the month, as a thin fog rolled in from the lake, I noticed movement at her property. A truck I didn't recognize backed into her driveway and idled for several minutes. Two men in plain work clothes emerged. carrying clipboards and surveying the perimeter with slow, deliberate steps. From my vantage on the porch, I could see Carol following them, gesturing toward my cabin with sharp, purposeful motions. The men spent nearly an hour measuring and photographing before departing. Carol lingered on the driveway long after they left, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the cabin like a hawk stalking prey. Later that afternoon, a thick envelope appeared in my mailbox, sealed with a formal-looking county stamp. Inside was a notice of complaint, stating that a citizen had alleged potential zoning and building code violations at my property. The report cited everything from unpermitted construction to improper dock repairs, each claim carefully worded to imply serious infractions. I knew instantly who had filed it. The timing almost made me smile. Carol's strategy was transparent. When the HOA failed, she had turned to county authorities, hoping bureaucracy might succeed where her personal crusade had not. I wasn't worried. From the start, every renovation had been done by licensed contractors and approved through the proper permits. Still, I gathered my neatly organized folder, deeds, permits, inspection records, and prepared for the inevitable visit. The county inspector arrived 2 days later, a practical man with a quiet demeanor. Together we walked the property while I provided every document he requested. He checked each detail with methodical precision: the dock supports, the porch's new beams, the freshly sealed windows. After an hour, he closed his clipboard and offered a small, satisfied nod. "Everything here is in perfect order," he said, handing back my papers. As his truck disappeared down the lane, I glanced across the road. Carol stood half-hidden behind her curtain, the glow of her phone screen reflecting in the glass. Our eyes met for a fleeting second before she turned away. That evening, as the sun set in streaks of amber and violet, I drafted one final letter. It was short, professional, and unyielding. I outlined the inspector's findings, reaffirmed the property's legal independence from the HOA, and reminded her that filing false complaints could invite legal consequences of its own. I ended with a simple statement: any further harassment will be documented and addressed through the proper channels. I delivered the letter personally, sliding it into her mailbox under the cold moonlight. The lake lay still, its surface silvered by the night sky. The next morning, for the first time since I'd arrived at Crescent Lake, Carol approached my driveway. Gone was the stiff posture and sharp glare. She stood a few feet away, arms crossed loosely, her eyes wary but subdued. No words passed between us. After a long moment, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod before turning back toward her house. In the days that followed, the transformation was unmistakable. Her curtains opened to let in morning light. The steady whir of her hedge trimmers returned, but without the performative aggression of before. When neighbors passed, she greeted them with a civility that lacked the old edge of command. It was as if the quiet acknowledgement of boundaries had finally settled into place. The neighborhood itself seemed lighter. Martin stopped by to admire the finished cabin, his voice warm with approval. Joggers and dog walkers offered easy smiles as they passed. Even the lake reflected a new serenity, its surface calm under a sky clearing of autumn clouds. One crisp afternoon, I stood at the end of the rebuilt dock, the water below rippling with the soft hues of late-season sunlight. The cabin behind me glowed with the satisfaction of work completed and order restored. Across the road, Carol's house stood neat and quiet, its windows open to the fading day. I thought of the chain of events, of the calls to the police, the false complaints, the endless letters, and how each act of control had ultimately unraveled into a lesson she hadn't expected to learn. Not through confrontation or retaliation, but through steady patience and unshakable proof of ownership. The wind stirred the pine trees, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke across the water. I breathed deeply, feeling the calm settle over the lake and the neighborhood alike. Carol had made her final move, and it had ended not with victory or humiliation, but with a quiet acceptance. The lake belonged to no one and everyone, and now, at last, peace belonged to both of us.